Well, thank you very much, especially for the Growth Lab, the invitation to present what has been the experience in Costa Rica in what I hope by the end of the conversation, it will be a really interesting case to promote the debate around how countries, especially in Latin America, can diversify and become less poor, less unequal, and less volatile. In the sense of the agenda, I'm going to briefly make the case of why is it that we're talking about Costa Rica in the first place? Why is it an interesting case to talk about? Second, I'm going to talk about how we have been working on solving constraints, particularly around the diversification of services, because as you all seen a couple of slides, Costa Rica has diversified beyond services, but the talk is going to be focused on what we did particularly for that sector, and then some future challenges and opportunities, which is going to be just some talking points that we can hopefully later engage in the discussion of how do countries will be able to adapt to some of the challenges that at least I foresee would be the main ones in countries like ours. And obviously then Q&A. So some facts and figures about Costa Rica. As you can see from the people who are familiar with the Atlas of Economic Complexity, Costa Rica has really diversified its exports. You can see in the bottom top corner, sorry, we had in the 80s textile industry that basically completely disappeared, has completely disappeared. And what are we going to be focusing on today is this big portion of exports, which are very knowledge-intensive services, and how Costa Rica was able to move beyond some traditional export commodities to more not only knowledge-intensive, but with a lot more value-added exports. As was mentioned, Costa Rica in 2020 and 21 became the #1 country in the world in the attraction of greenfield investments relative to the size of their economy. That means that given the size of our economy, we're attracting 13 more times that was expected of us. So that's part of why Costa Rica is an interesting case to discuss. And in terms of export services, we are exporting right now 2 times the average of what the OECD countries ratio, and we have 16 of the top 100 companies in IT that are located in Costa Rica. This is, for us, I mean, a relative small economy with a GDP of 60 billion, 5.7 billion are basically from knowledge-intensive services exports. And we are #1 exporter of IT services per capita in LATAM. This is just a small representation of the type of companies that are located in the country, that are operating there. When I was minister, this was the slide that I used the most when I was going to pitch to other companies why they should invest in Costa Rica. This was the best proof of concept that we had, that Costa Rica offers the right conditions for a company like the ones that I was speaking to be able to operate in a successful way. But it's just to give you an idea. There's a mix of good exporting and service exporting companies, but just as you can see, the diversity of companies that have been able to attract and grow in a small country like ours. And then just so you can see the growth, because the way that we measure when we're talking about FDI and export promotion, we want to make sure that this is measured not only of capital flows to the country. We want to make sure that it actually creates jobs. And as you can see, there's been a very meaningful growth in the number of jobs that have been created in this sector and the number of companies that are operating within that sector in this period of the last 20 years. And it has been having a very high average annual growth rate. This is the volume of export that I mentioned before. But as you can see, it's a sustained growth that we've been having for almost 20 years. And interesting is the share of knowledge-intensive services versus other traditional services that continue to grow in the country, but just represent less of what we do. And this is the comparison of business and IT services versus tourism. As you can see, how they have been flipping around the amount that they contribute to the overall exports of services in the country. This slide, just to make a point that when we are trying to study the impact of FDI and diversification of exports, we are also very critical about how is this helping our economy grow in different ways. So what we're trying to study in the country, because this has been studied in many countries around the world, and you get very different results. In the case of Costa Rica, and what I'm going to argue afterwards is that deliberate policies have been aiming at making sure that we are able to bring companies that are able to link to the local economy, create positive spillovers. And as you can see from some of the results of the studies that have been done in country, they create linkages that improve wages, improve productivity, and improve job creation with companies that become suppliers of those multinational corporations. And we also have been able to understand where are those companies coming from and where they're exporting. And this is an important part of the story because in the end, what this translates is into resilience, because we are not depending of companies just coming from one country and not companies exporting just to one destination, makes us way more resilient. Not only is diversifying away from commodities that makes us resilient, is also moving into different markets, not depending on one end market or one country of origin for where the FDI inflows are coming. This is also an important part of the resilience aspect of diversification. Very briefly, this is a slide that just says how much of the procurement from those companies have become to local suppliers. As you can see, it has been increasing, and this is very positive. And this slide is in Spanish, but what it says is out of those local suppliers who are linked to the multinational corporations, are those other foreign companies that are located in the country that are supplying, or they're actually local Costa Rican companies? And as you can see, just by the numbers here, these are the local Costa Rican companies. So the story is not only that we bring multinational corporations and then other multinational corporations become their suppliers, but it's actually local companies who are being able to link to those multinational corporations and link themselves to the global value chains and have all those positive impacts of spillovers and linkages that I saw. So that, I'm sorry that went really fast. That was just painting the picture that it makes an interesting case. I'm going to go a little bit slower just when you're talking about how we went about solving constraints and how we went about becoming what I would argue is a global leader in services. So I'm going to mention a couple of reasons, a couple of variables that go beyond services and just explain what Costa Rica has been able to diversify. And then I'm going to go deep into very specific things that relate mostly to services. But you can't tell the story of services without understanding what happened back in the 80s. As some of you may know, we had a big crisis, the so-called lost decade of Latin America. In the case of Costa Rica, we failed with an import substitution strategy. We had high levels of debt that eventually led to a crisis that blew inflation through the roof, unemployment and poverty. And that really made us question our development model. And then that was the turning point. We recognized that as a small country with a very small domestic market, we needed an export-driven model. We needed a way to connect to the global economy because we couldn't be self-sufficient. That was the conclusion at around the 80s. And what happened was in the 1990s, there was decisions around institutional design. And this is a very important part of the story because the institutional design and capacities that were created in that moment is the thread throughout the past 20 years that have been part of what Costa Rica has been able to come up with very successful policy, not only design, but implementation. And very quickly, what was thought at the moment is that we needed a Ministry of Foreign Trade with two implementing arms, our Export Promotion Agency and our Investment Promotion Agency. And there were three things that were going to link them: budgeting, governance, and obviously the labor relations, which is a small but important caveat. So the Ministry of Foreign Trade is also the executive president of the Export Promotion Agency, okay? But the Export Promotion Agency, the board, is mostly from the private sector. And that was deliberately made because people thought that we need to be able to do long-term policy implementation. And that requires the private sector to be able to, provide a counterbalance to what elections every 4 years can do to policy making. And then the way that Procomer, our export promotion agency, was going to finance itself is through a tax on exports and through our free trade zone regime, where I'm going to mention about, because that is also part of the story. Part of the financing from that regime and the exports also finance our import promotion agency, and they finance the Ministry of Foreign Trade. So that creates a very integrated way of understanding the whole sector of foreign trade, but at the same time, it has the private sector representation in the board of Procomer, and CINDE is actually a nonprofit that is run like a private sector. And what I mentioned about labor relations is that Procomer, as an export promotion agency, actually has a different labor relation contract than the rest of the government. So it's basically almost run like a private company, but it's still a public institution. So that's part of the story, as you hopefully will see in the next slides. So what did they do, these three organizations? They decided, well, Costa Rica needs to integrate to the world. So what we did is we set out a long-term planning of how we're going to do a liberalization process of connecting us to the world. And maybe you can see the whole process, but the important thing is now Costa Rica has 16 free trade agreements and connects us basically to 75% of the global economy. Why is that important? Because if you're an export in Costa Rica, or if you're a company that wants to invest in Costa Rica, when you open operations there, you automatically have preferential access to basically the whole world. That translates a market of 5 million people to a market of billions. And as you can see from the dots there, that means not only throughout whole Americas, but the European Union, the UK, China, Singapore, South Korea. Basically, a company now looks to Costa Rica because it can reach those markets in a very preferential way. And then I could talk about, this across the board policies that have been made in Costa Rica to describe why is it a success story. And there's a lot of things that we can talk about, but I'm just going to focus on the ones that have played a particular role for services. The first one is Intel. Intel is a case of what Professor here, Hausman, likes to call a strategic bets approach. In what sense? Costa Rica made a big jump to be able to land Intel back in the 1990s, 95, 96, because there wasn't like a growing sector of electronics manufacturing in the country. And it wasn't like the country decided, well, let's just improve our education and improve, a laundry list of items, and then Intel will come. It wasn't like that. We actually reached out to Intel and said, what would you need to be able to go to Costa Rica and open your new manufacturing plant in Costa Rica? What would it take for us? So it was very demand driven. And it was a lot of things. It was with education, it was with infrastructure, it was with custom controls, with airports, connectivity. It was a long number of things that helped us have this collateral impact of improving our business climate, of signaling, because that sent a strong signal to the world saying Costa Rica is open for business. Because if Intel is there, then it has to offer certain things that a company like that can operate. And then it had positive economic growth. There has been tons of studies, like trying to understand what has been the effect in Costa Rica. This is just one. This is a synthetic control method for those economists out there that was done to compare the Costa Rica with Intel versus the Costa Rica without Intel. What would have happened? And as you can see, this line is the dotted line, vertical dotted line is where Intel arrived. The black line is the Costa Rica with Intel, and the dotted line, the black dotted line, is the Costa Rica without Intel. So it had a big impact in economic growth in the country. But again, the important thing to rescue is this put us on the map for companies throughout every sector. Then at that moment, at the end of the 1990s, start of the 2000s, services companies started putting an eye on us. And when they were starting to look for where to invest, now Costa Rica was part of that list. Our free trade zone regime has played a very important role, not only in attracting Intel, but particularly for services. Because I think the key takeaway here is that we have been evolving in our free trade zone regime. And it has been evolving not only to comply with international regulations like the OECD standards. There's now a global discussion around what is called base erosion and profit shifting, the BEPS pillars at the OECD, which is basically a way of trying to say, how can we get companies to avoid tax loopholes? And for us, and this is a very deliberate policy, we created the free trade zone regime not to bring shell corporations. We didn't create the free trade zone regime in a way that allows companies to say they're operating without creating economic development and jobs. And that's a very deliberate policy because it automatically rules companies who are not in that space to want to invest. But what was required, because this, as you can imagine, started with a focus on companies who were manufacturing companies. But then when we started talking, like I mentioned, to the services companies, they said, well, we also want to be part of this. But how do we comply with the free trade zone regime if we don't have the same measures of a manufacturing company? We can't be measured by the amount of physical goods that get out of the door, nor by the physical space that we use. So what we did, and this is something that sounds trivial, but these are the type of things that make all the difference when happening doing policy making. We had to take the customs officials to do a tour of the companies so they could understand the business dynamics of a services company besides and compare it with a manufacturing one. And then in 2020, we had to update our index because some of the companies, the services companies, were trying to find loopholes in a way that they were allowed to say we're operating in Costa Rica without really creating jobs. So what we did is we created an index. We create an index to evaluate the companies, and if they don't comply with what's the strategic nature of the firm, the amount of linkages that could be created, what's your payroll, the investments, the amount of jobs that are created, and if you comply with those, then you can get access to the free trade zone regime. And for example, in 2022, early 22, one of the last things that I was deeply involved in was how do we modify this free trade zone regime to get more investments in less developed areas of the country. So we created another set of incentives trying to say, well, companies, if you are going to be located outside, let's say the capital, or in an area which apparently doesn't have the productivity factors that are required for you to operate, we're going to try to subsidize that in ways that not only helps us bring an investment to those areas, but at the same time help us drive an agenda that is very coherent with our development model. So we're pursuing, for example, incentives for companies that are using renewable energy, who are providing access to education, labor costs, etc. The other big policy decision here was the private industrial parks. In Costa Rica, industrial parks are privately run, and they are competing against each other, and they are competing against industrial parks around the world on how to attract companies. Because when a company wants to invest in Costa Rica, hopefully they will have, like we call it, a llave en mano, which means like a build to operate, in the sense that industrial parks have now not only sophisticated their services so much that they're able to offer a whole range of services for a company when it gets located in Costa Rica. So they say, well, you need clinical services, you need a supermarket, you need education and training centers. That's all going to be located within the industrial park where your company operates. And that's a very important aspect because not only it helps us compete with other parks around the world, and as you can see, there's evaluations of what are the best parks around the world. We have one in the top 10 around the world, but more and more companies are looking for additional services which are privately provided that can complement what comes from the public sector. Then when we started talking with companies back in, like I mentioned, early 2000s, there was a big issue in the country around connectivity. As you can imagine, if you're a service company, connectivity is a very important part of the equation. But in Costa Rica, we had one national provider. It was a monopoly by the state. It was a state-owned enterprise. So we created a workforce, basically, in which we brought the vice presidents of telecom from those big services companies to tell us exactly what they needed to be able to operate. And that meant we had to come up with agreements, with contracts, with our telecom provider, ICE, to be able to identify the potential points of failure and make sure that they were getting the service that was required. Again, this was a big update, part of our national provider. And it helped, ironically, it helped us, that state-owned enterprise, be better prepared because we were already discussing our free trade agreement with the United States, which was signed in 2004, which by 2008 required the opening of the telecom market. So once other companies arrived in the country, providing connectivity became easier because there was competition. But in that moment, it was working with a state-owned enterprise to make sure it understood what do these multinational corporations needed to be able to operate efficiently in terms of connectivity in the country. Then the other big thing that happened was we were working before that with the Ministry of Education and INA, which is a technical education institution, to provide skills for manufacturing. But services companies said, well, we're going to be providing services to clients outside of Costa Rica. And what that ended happening was that throughout this last 20 years, we have been working to develop, basically on demand by the industry, programs that are taught both in high schools, at the technical education level, less so at the universities, but that respond directly what companies are looking for talent. And the one example, in the early 2000s, we were not training accounting people to understand, generally accepted accounting principles that are used in the US. We taught accounting for Costa Rica, but nobody knew that. So we had to bring people to teach that, to develop a curriculum, to be taught in high school so people could already enter the workforce. And obviously that helped with the skills and labor connection. We still have and continue to develop hundreds of custom-made training programs that are done even within the companies. So not only is that we have the training centers, we have been able to move those programs into the companies because of the need for reskilling and retooling that needs to happen in place, and not only for new people who are looking for a job. And just so you get an idea of not only accounting principles have been taught, these have been evolving. So this is just a list so you can get an idea of the amount of things that have been now. These are the things, the skills and the type of jobs that are doing people who work in the services sector. As you can see, and there's lists and lists, but each one of them required sometimes tweaking what was being taught in the universities, in high schools, and the technical centers. And by that, what I mean is this is not only trade policy. This is a lot of coordination along a lot of institutions to be able to provide this type of business climate that companies require. Then one of the last issues that has been very critical is our value proposition. We have been updating our value proposal because we want to make sure that the trade agenda is also very aligned with the vision of development that the country has. And that doesn't happen organically. We want to make sure that our value proposition that we call people, planet, and prosperity helps not only our sector, meaning export diversification and FDI flows, move towards this agenda, but also helps the multinational corporations with their agenda. We want to make sure there's a match. So when we go out talking to companies, this is part of what we tell them. This is type of slides that we use. And this is not only a nice slide. For example, in Costa Rica, electricity is generated 99.5% from renewable energy. What does that mean for a multinational corporation? That the moment it sets foot in Costa Rica and switches the light on, it's operating on renewables. That's a very competitive advantage, not only because they're competing with other sites across the world on their internal KPIs around sustainability. They can tell investors, they can tell customers that whatever it is that it's produced in Costa Rica is produced on renewable energy, right? So this makes sense for companies, but it helps also create a self-selection of the type of company that wants to go to Costa Rica because of this, which is part of our value proposal. And then something that might seem trivial, but it is not, is that when you want to bring companies to operate, you're bringing managers, you're bringing vice presidents of operations, you're bringing outside people. And outside people are going to ask where I'm going to put my kids to study. What happens if I have an accident? Is there access to a hospital? What will I do during the weekends? And those things create a big difference. So making sure that Costa Rica continues to offer quality of life for not only our local people, but from investors is a big difference, especially with remote work nowadays. So obviously, they're looking for connectivity. They want to be able to move from their headquarters to Costa Rica and from Costa Rica to where they have operations. So having direct flights to US, to Europe, to Latam, to airports, this plays a big role also. And this is something that you can already tell that if Costa Rica for many years already had a big tourism strategy, this is where things become complementary, right? Having offered the infrastructure and the connectivity for tourism, now is playing a dual role for attracting the C-suite and the managers that are required to come to the country. And finally, the evolution of trade institutions. CINDE started being an investment advisory. As things evolved more recently, for example, it has been named one of the best or the best investment promotion agency in the world by the ITC for many years. It now, for example, offered other type of services, especially what we call retention expansion, which is aftercare. We started thinking, well, if the company is already here, who's working with that company to solve all the issues on the day-to-day? Issues around skilling, issues around new bandwidth needs, issues around certifications. Who's going to be working to provide a communication between the companies and the policymakers? So a whole unit was created around that. Same with linkages that I'm going to mention briefly. Same with Procomer. Procomer has evolved as an export promotion agency to make sure that companies are able not only to keep exporting locally, local companies keep exporting, but also help the multinationals with their exports. And how do we create more linkages? How do we keep working on that? So now, for example, this is very recent that we launched a couple of years ago, is it might seem like we're duplicating roles, but both CINDE and Procomer are now working, both CINDE from the multinational corporations, trying to understand what would they need to be linked with more local suppliers, and Procomer with the small and medium enterprises that are local, what do they need to be able to link to the big corporations? And just to wrap up, as you can imagine, this not only has been a success story, there's lots of challenges. The first one is what Professor Roderick here calls the good jobs, bad jobs paradox. There's a lot of companies and jobs that have been created here, but in Costa Rica, we also have another economy, right? Companies who are able to be connected to the global value chains, have higher levels of productivity, have a wage premium, create lots of jobs, but there's a lot of small and medium enterprises that are not connected to the global value chains, are not exporting, and that creates a dual economy. And there's an issue of inequality that then creates political tensions that then puts into question this whole model. So it's something that you can't just avoid. Sustainability is both an opportunity and a challenge. I would say, for example, now financial services corporations in Costa Rica are telling us, well, we need our financial analysts to provide consulting and advice on ESG standards to all our clients. Can you come up with a curriculum? Can you train them for people to know how to do that? So then we can create a hub around sustainability. That's an opportunity. The next two things are what I believe is the biggest challenge that we have, and the biggest challenge that I would say many countries in the region will have is around skills. Because a green transition or the orange economy or the blue economy or the purple economy or any economy requires skills transformation. And this is a break in the paradigm both for education, because education, what has been doing historically is we get young people, we educate them, and we send them to the labor market. They still have that pressure, especially in Latin America, of a lot of young people who are outside schooling. But now all those companies that I mentioned are knocking the door on the education system saying, hey, these people have been out of university or other technical school. They graduated 3 years ago. Their skills are obsolete. We need to retrain them. What can you do to retrain them? So the education system is having not only the pressure of the young people that need to be educated, but of older people whose skills are becoming obsolete at a faster rate. Private sector can't do it alone. Public sector needs to understand the needs from the private sector. So this is going to be a big, big challenge for whatever policy around structural transformation in any country, and how do you keep up with that? And then we have global discussions around minimum taxes and new trade agreements, for example, the DEPA, which is something that we want to be part of. We started analyzing it. It's the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, is how to use trade to promote more exchange of, in this case, of services in the digital economy. And then challenges for linkages, as you can imagine, intellectual property rights, certificates are still a challenge to be done. But if I were to focus here on one big challenge that we have, is the skilling, reskilling, retooling challenge of any structural transformation that any economy around the world is going to be having. And we don't have that many examples around the world of how to do that in a way that is inclusive and that it actually provides the skills for people to keep up in the labor market. So I'll stop there and I'll open for questions.
Okay, well, Andres, thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. So yeah, we're gonna follow up with a couple of questions from our discussion, and then we'll pass along the mics for the audience to participate. So uh, as a first question, so as a Latin American, I'm especially fascinated and an admirer of Costa Rica, as we were discussing before starting the event, because Costa Rica has been a pioneer in many sectors, starting with environmental conservation, as probably most of the people know, and probably a feeling most of the Latin Americans share towards your country. And one of the things I was thinking was a lot of Latin American countries have tried diversification strategies with varying degrees of success. But maybe some have been either overambitious or not strategic enough at targeting the right sectors, or even maybe have been oblivious of a capability or skill-based approach as it has been done. So one of the questions I had, because the strategy seemed to work very well, was which trade-offs did the country make, and how was the strategy narrowed down not to be something extremely either overambitious or very vague that could potentially backfire for the country?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I've always said, and we always say, is that we've always had this boutique approach to the sectors and the areas in which we thought we could compete. This meant that everything from the companies that we target, as our trade organizations have been evolving. For example, now CINDE uses AI and machine learning to understand what are the best people to reach out to in which companies that are going to be able to respond positively to our value proposal. So it's very targeted. And that also responds again to what is it that the country can offer. That's one thing. It's the boutique approach, and making to understand that we can't compete in everything and we're not good in everything. So we have to focus. We can't just go out to every international fair looking for whoever wants to invest. It's very, very, very specific. But at the same time, on the other end, from the policy perspective, and this is something that Professor mentions a lot, we didn't work with a laundry list approach of let's try to do everything and try to game every index out there. We were very specific in terms of setting the right spaces for this public-private discussion to happen, to be able to really understand what were the drivers behind the investment decisions of companies and target those. After we understood which were the sectors that we really wanted to target. Instead of saying, well, if we improve in whatever things that we believe is what drives the interest of companies, we went the other way around. So a very boutique approach and a very, very proactively and conscious way of creating the spaces for having the public and private discussions around what are the driving factors behind the investment decisions that will get the company to invest and reinvest in the country.
Fascinating. And then, well, the other question I had, I think it's partly an observation from the talk, and like probably other people in the audience. I found it fascinating how you labeled tourism as a sector that is traditional for Costa Rica. Well, there are still like many countries that are willing to have a world class like tourism sector, like the one you have. So one of the questions I had was what role did tourism play? Like you partly like mentioned in terms of like the quality of life,
Mhm.
but from the capabilities you had constructed from the tourism industry, what did this play in the country's transformation that you just
Mhm.
exposed?
Well, it wasn't planned out, but as you can imagine, there's a lot of, you know, second order effects that having a strong tourism industry in the country played out. And tourism continues to play a very important role in our development of our economy because, as they say, the tourism dollar is very democratic, right? It's gets spread out in many different places in the country. It reaches many small communities, it's many suppliers and many type of services. But by building a tourism industry, it meant that we already had invested in infrastructure. As you saw, the flights; those flights were initially created for tourists, but then it became a way of luring in C-suits and managers into the country. And the other interesting thing is English. The level of English is one very big defining factor for those companies on where to invest. And a lot of it was driven initially because we needed people to speak English to be able to work in the tourism industry. And that played, I mean, it's not the same level of English, and but the whole idea of the importance of having a second language then played an important role, and that actually is um, one of the factors that gets played out because you can have great software developers, you can have great people who know about cloud computing, but most of the clients, if you're a multinational corporation, if you're exporting services, you need to be able to do that in English. And that's a big thing. That was partially of tourism. Um, and yeah, I would say those two things really played a role now, and they continue to bounce, mutually. And then like I mentioned, our value proposal is the same that our tourism uh, institution and ministry uses when they go out to promote the country. The value proposal is very consistent, and that coherence also provides assurance that this is not only a bluff, that the country really sticks to what we're trying to offer, because at the end of the day, investors, what they look for is certainty, right? So, and long-term certainty.
Great, great, thanks. And I'll just have like one last small big question before we go for Q&A, which is basically what is next in Costa Rica strategy?
Oh, that's a big question. One of the things that we had a big discussion planning, like the strategic planning for these three institutions that I mentioned for the trade sector, was that we could double down on the medical devices, on the services, and keep going down that path, or we could try to do something riskier, but I think it's more important, which is how do we play a bigger role in the inclusion question that I put out there. And what we ended up thinking is that we needed to shift, not stop doing, all that I mentioned around services. And I didn't mention it, but the main good that we export right now is medical devices. And we keep bringing companies around that. But we made a very conscious decision of saying, how can this group of institutions support the agricultural transformation that the country needs to go through? Uh, and that's complex because um, agriculture, as you can imagine, is an industry that obviously is located in rural areas, in areas where there's least development, and it requires a lot of investment in technology that sometimes displaces a lot of people. So how do you account for job creation in that sector? You have to start thinking bigger picture in terms of food services, and how can Costa Rica become a better player in that. There is a part in terms of creating new export capabilities, moving traditional agriculture to agri-tech and agro-export. And we made that conscious effort, and now that's what we're working on. We're trying to see how can Costa Rica better compete, because we know that Latin America has a role to play internationally as the food basket of the world potentially, but also in terms of climate change. How do we climate-proof agriculture? That also has to do with how do we make it more productive? How can it have better practices, because most of agriculture in Latin America is unsustainable, it's very low productivity. There's a lot of small and medium landowners. So how do we work around these questions from the perspective of the trade sector is what we were working on, and I would say that's a future that departs a little bit from the things that I've already mentioned that we've been doing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's see. First question from the audience. So here, I believe on the third row.
Thank you. Thank you for the very insightful talk. I have two quick questions. So the first one is, foreign direct investment comes with a flip side, right? Which is the legal constraints that effectively come with the agreements. How did Costa Rica deal, and how are you dealing, for example, with regulatory chill effects that those bring to the country and may impede like other policies that you want to take on? That's the first one. And the second one is, I was just curious to see how else did you manage to gain those spillovers from the foreign direct investment, other than, for example, the indexes you mentioned in the free trade zones?
So the first question is a very big debate globally around the collateral effect of trade liberalization. What does that mean in terms of regulatory or rules of the game that now the country abides to? I think, given that we've made a very conscious effort of making sure that we understood that trade liberalization per se was not going to be the panacea, right? That was going to solve all our development problems. We had to make sure that our free trade zone regime and all the investment really translated into development. So, for example, we've been very conscious of measuring what is the impact of offering tax exemptions to companies in the country. We've been very conscious about measuring that, and every year the index we come up with an index, it gets updated, and we are able to demonstrate that for every dollar that we give a company to invest, we get $2 back. And why do I say that? Because, as you said, it comes with a cost. If you're not able to demonstrate to all the citizens in the country that this actually improves either tax revenues, that it improves the capacity of creating jobs and opportunities for people, this model can really get debated politically and get torn down. So at the same time, we understood that if we're going to have a long-term strategy in trade liberalization, what a lot of companies look for and what we want to make sure that people perceive from Costa Rica is that we play by the rules. So the way that trade agreements are structured in Costa Rica legally and all that, it follows a very rigorous process that it has to end up in Congress, and Congress has to approve that. And it doesn't mean that Costa Rica hasn't been in legal debates around companies that want to invest and then they want to sue us. That happens all the time. But being very sure that on one end we're playing by the rules sends a very positive message, but at the same time, this needs, in one way or another, to be able to translate those trade-offs into more positive things. And if we are not able to convey that message and demonstrate technically that this at the end favors that whole development of the country, it would be just a nice effort that gets politically torn down very quickly, right? And the second question was? Oh, a lot of it, what we've been doing is, getting spillovers and linkages depends a lot on every sector. Every sector is very different. Some sectors have a way of understanding their suppliers that have so high levels of regulations that is very hard for people to link to. For example, medical devices. As you can imagine, the certifications that are required to be able to become a provider of, at least in their core supply chain, is very hard. But you can get, on not only on the core, but on other activities that are generated that you can link that. So it's about also picking which sectors we understand that there can be more linkages. And then a lot of it has to do with, we've been doing everything from doing technical assistance, providing capital for small and medium enterprises, making sure that the spaces are created for the multinational corporations to really explain what is it that they need from local providers, and then see how we close those gaps. So there's a lot of programs that are, again, providing technical assistance and financing to close the gaps between what they want and what the country can offer. And that doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes it's been long-term planning and getting local companies to achieve certifications, which sometimes are very expensive. That's, let's say, something that a lot of the time the government is willing to provide that capital for companies to do that. But again, it's very specific, tailor-made, and not on every sector. The pecking order is clear.
No, it's three quick questions. The first one is tell us about your headaches in designing a free trade zone to make it compatible with WTO. The second question is, since Jose Maria Figueres attracted Intel to Costa Rica, there's been enormous political change in Costa Rica in terms of the number of presidents and the number of parties that have been in power and so on. Everybody in Latin America complains about the inability to maintain policies between, when governments change. You mentioned a little bit in your presentation, but is there a secret of how to make more longer-term policies last? And number three, how do you prevent these very detailed customer-based policies and solutions not to be captured or?
What was the first question? About WTO, right?
Yeah.
So this has been a complex issue. And that's why I mentioned we went through six different models of our free trade zone regime to be able to comply with those standards. Because I think it would have been a bigger challenge if we were having a free trade zone regime that attracted companies for the purpose of being a tax haven or attracting shell corporations. Then it becomes really tricky because you're trying to game the system, because you have the WTO and the OECD telling you, no, you're not, you're using this just as a tax loophole, and companies are pressuring you to move that way. So by being very, very explicit that say, no, this index is very rigorous in the way that we evaluate when a company says, I'm going to invest and I want to apply for the free trade zone regime, you have to demonstrate, like I said, a level of investment, a level of job creations. You have to demonstrate how many of your general managers are going to be based in the country, how many local jobs are going to be, how many local suppliers are going to be linked to. So it's very rigorous. So just by that, it's very like also a self-selection process that it's done with a dual purpose. It helps us comply with those things, but it helps us also bring real compatible with what? Yes. Oh yeah. No, that's the thing. How do we comply with those standards without providing that tax loophole that the WTO and the WTO probably what they're going to be focusing on a lot is that we're providing, any type of support for exporters that are not, in legal competition with others, right? So we want to make sure that we comply with those. But I think at the core, it goes back to making sure that this is coherent, because by making sure we do that, we make sure that people understand the benefits and we actually have concrete benefits of economic development by that model. Otherwise, politically, going back to the other question, politically it would be very hard to sustain. And every time there's a new government, inevitably this discussion happens. That was with my case as well when I arrived, and that was one of the first questions that the media asked. What are you going to do with the free trade zone regime? Are we going to put more taxes on it? And then, because we've been very rigorous in evaluating the return of investment, very rigorous in demonstrating the number of jobs that they're created. And this is interesting because we have the breakdown of those jobs numbers. People say, well, but that's probably knowledge intensive services. That's only people for university. What about me, who I don't have a university degree? Well, if you look at the jobs for manufacturing medical devices, overwhelmingly, most of the people that go into those jobs are people from public high schools. There's almost a 50-50 parity between men and women. And a lot of those people come from rural areas as well. So by having all those information, all the data, you're able to come up with a really good argument of why politically it would be suicide to try to change this. Because again, you would be going against the thousands and thousands of people who work there, but also around the private sector, who has been a great ally and sometimes providing the threat between each administration that this makes sense. And you're able to actually have a narrative that makes it politically very costly to be able to go against this model that has provided so much. Now, the response that we explicitly did around agriculture is part of that discussion. But like politically, you can only do so much. You also need to demonstrate, well, a lot of people are saying, well, how do we get more of this investment but where I live, which is outside the capital? So that you saw that we did a modification on our free trade zone regime to go drive investment to those areas with preferential benefits if you invest outside there, but also this focus on agriculture, because it's a very big tension of who ends up benefiting from an initiative like this that drives at the end the political discussion. And I forgot about it. Was there a third question? Oh, the capture incentives. Well, in that case, Costa Rica, I would say, is the opposite, right? As one of the presidents of the OEA told us on a visit many years ago, he said, Costa Rica, you have an excess of democracy. In the sense that there's so many institutions, there's so many veto points and control points that captured by the private sector is very hard. Actually, our challenge is how do we overcome, the stagnation, the inertia of our public institutions that are not moving as fast as the ones that I just described here. So, like as you saw, that trade sector is designed in a way that moves very quickly, and we're able to hire people that are very specialized, very technical, are very well paid, but they are moving in a way that is way faster than the rest of the institutions. So the challenge is, how do we get the rest of institutions to move as fast? And maybe one thing to complement that is that when we're looking for companies to come to the country, we're not, we want to make sure that they are really, really aligned and they're really responding to our vision of development. Not that it doesn't mean that we don't tailor the suit for them when they're, having to make the decision of where to come, but we want to attract certain kind of companies that are aligned to this vision that I propose, the value proposal that we have.
We have like time for a couple of questions. I want to make one question that came through Zoom before maybe yielding to one last question from the room. So the question is, how was the coordination needed to change domestic policy, regulations, etc. done? Did the Ministry of Foreign Affairs lead it? A previous slide showed that the expert-driven model included the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, seen the AMPROCOMER. Why didn't it include the Ministry of Economy? Is there an institutional arrangement you would have done differently?
It's interesting. Well, in every country, this is different, but in Costa Rica, we have a Ministry of Foreign Trade, and then we have a Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Labor, like they're separate. We also have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is different one from Ministry of Foreign Trade. Again, some countries have it together. This was done, again, deliberately that way, because, well, those institutions already existed in the country. And at that moment, people realized we need a new institution that will basically coordinate this triangle of the trade sector. And it was deliberately made with those characteristics in terms of governance, in terms of budgeting, in terms of labor relationships, because we saw that this meant that Costa Rica was going to compete with the rest of the world, and we needed to have like this spearhead to lead a lot of that. Now, It doesn't mean that all the domestic reforms and policies were not very politically complex. And there has been a lot of debates. There was a very big debate politically, a lot of social movement when Costa Rica was debating the CAFTA with the CAFTA DR, with the trade agreement with the US. It brought a lot of people to the streets. It ended up being a referendum that it passed, but it was very contentious politically. Nowadays, because people have seen the benefits of it, I think it just provided more momentum. But if the whole model wouldn't have been able to deliver what it had promised, I think we could have seen a very different trajectory of where the country was headed. But I think it just by demonstrating, especially our focus not only of understanding flows in terms of dollars, but actually on job creation and how this helps the people, it has been a key driver in the discussion of how to maintain and keep modifying domestic policies that allows us to keep competing on a global scale.
And yeah, question from the back.
Thank you. Building on one of the questions of Professor Hausman, Latin America is having a backlash to populism. And with that, there's no continuity of sound public policies. Do you see that possibility in Costa Rica, or is bulletproof of that reality?
Well, definitely not bulletproof. Again, there are certain policies that are more costly politically just to change because of how ingrained they are in the country or how much value people perceive. There are others in which if you change them, you're not going to have organized people around that cause to oppose it. But in this case, at least in what we've been speaking today, there's a lot of organized consensus and momentum that if a politician would try to change this direction and this model around export diversification, he would immediately feel the about a lot of backlash, a lot of social unrest, and a lot of coordinated movements that would make it very costly to oppose. It's not the same with other policies, which are more easy to change because, again, there's not an organized group of actors around it, or the benefits are just felt across the board. So you don't have someone who has the voice, the political voice to prevent that backlash, and then maybe that's more vulnerable to political populism, but definitely not bulletproof. I mean, one of the lessons that we've been seeing is that no country is safe from this populism rising and tendencies of democracy to backslide.
Andres, again, thank you so much
Thank you.
on behalf
Thank you.
of the Growth Lab and the broad HKS community, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you.